The issue with field instruments is that they cannot be read from the control room. So this means that there should always be an operator in the field to track the reading. Although this may be applicable in case of startup, this cannot be accepted for most readings that need to be tracked during normal operation. That's why most instruments are transmitters that read the value and send it to the DCS in order to be read from the control room. The DCS stands for Distributed Control System. This is the system that is responsible for process monitoring and control during normal operation. For a shutdown, we can use a separate system, which is SIS or ESD system, as we have mentioned before. From the DCS, we cannot just see the reading from the control room continuously, which already gives the operator the opportunity to better control the plant performance. But we can also track the history of the readings with time, which can give an indication of the performance along with time. This is shown from a graphic display that shows all the necessary readings. In addition to displaying the reading, these transmitters can also be used for adding custom values and calculating some values from the reading, such as flow totalizers, or adding different readings or carrying out the required calculation so that the product of this calculation is always shown directly to the operator on the control room. So now let's see some examples of performance indication transmitters. One of the famous examples of this case is tracking the performance of an exchanger versus fouling. So we can monitor the fluid outlet temperature we need. Let's see an example here, a shell and tube exchanger. The cold fluid is flowing in the tube side and the hot fluid is in the shell side. So we are monitoring the inlet and outlet temperatures on both the shell side and the tube side. Now we can judge if the exchanger does its job well by checking out the outlet temperature, and depending on the criticality of the exchanger operation, we may need to add a low alarm on the cold side outlet temperature. This shall alert the operator, as this means that the fluid wasn't heated enough. Or we can add a high alarm on the hot fluid outlet to alert if the hot fluid wasn't cooled enough. Remember that the hot fluid is the fluid which is entering the exchanger as hot and it shall be cooled. So if a high alarm on the hot fluid outlet was triggered, this means that cooling wasn't enough. We may not need to add alarms on each side of the exchanger. This depends on the criticality of the case. But we can add it when we target an exact temperature and we don't want deviations from this temperature. As the exchanger gets fouled with time, the temperature starts to deviate the required outlet temperature, whether it is higher or lower, which means that the exchanger's performance is starting to decrease. So once the temperature is too far from expected, the exchanger would need to get out of service in order to be cleaned. So to monitor the performance of the equipment, it would be better to monitor the parameters that directly affect their performance. For exchangers, we were talking about inlet and outlet temperatures. For a tower, we need to monitor the temperature of the trays. Maybe we can add a temperature transmitter for every frequent number of trays, maybe for example every 5 to 10 trays, depending on the number of tower trays. We would also need to monitor the pressure drop across some range of trays, as pressure drop is a clear indicator of whether the tower is hydraulically stable or not. So here we shall add a high alarm in case of a higher pressure drop at each tower section. For a compressor, as the compressor is so sensitive to the fluid inlet flow, pressure, and temperature, it's common to add instruments measuring the flow, pressure, and temperature on both compressor suction and discharge. These are not just used for indication, but for control and shutdown of the compressor, as the compressor needs complicated logic solvers. This is related to compressor anti-surge control. I have talked about anti-surge in the compressor course. You can check it out in the bonus section if you like. But for a vessel, we shall need to monitor the vessel's levels. We may need also to monitor the pressure, the inlet and outlet flows in order to measure the degree of separation. Maybe there is no separation here, it's just a surge vessel. Maybe we won't need all these parameters. That's why we should always evaluate the parameters we need to monitor. For reactors, in addition to pressure and temperature, we may also use online analyzers, which can give the composition of a specific component in the reactor effluent in order to monitor the reactor's performance online. So, depending on the system or the equipment, it's always important to determine the parameters that mostly affect the process performance and add the instruments that measure the parameters in order to make it easy for the operator to monitor the plant performance and track issues as early as possible.